All right, this is another video that I wanted to do. So basically, what I wanted to talk today about is about pretty much of how um, we live in a generation now. We want to look at today's. Um, we want to look at the past history with today's lenses, and the thing is that doesn't work. I wanted to talk today about the Immigration Act in 1790. This is something that liberals, Marxists, socialists, social justice warriors, and white supremacists alike use this to say that this country was meant to be only for whites and was meant to be racist since the beginning. Okay, so the Constitution is separate. The 1790 Immigration Act, that is just a law. It's not really part of the Constitution. I mean, it technically is, but it's not in the Constitution and Bill of Rights and the amendments and the Constitution Act. It is just a law. And the 1790 Immigration Act, it was saying that they were promoting white immigration, okay, during that time. As time progressed, we see how many of these immigration policies changed. Sometimes there was a time when they limit immigration to Italians. There was a time when, they were very flexible to Latin American immigrants because they were just considered white, even though they weren't, But they were labeled as white. Just like today, Middle Easterns are considered white, even though many of them have darker skin. So the thing is that the 1790 Immigration Act, what they try to say is that, like going back, they're trying to use the past and they try to compare it with today's lenses, and that doesn't work. And I want to give you the context of what's happening, the historical context of what was happening during that time. Number one, America was a new country, and when America is a new country, they need to find an agreement. You see, what was the regional powers in that time? You had France; it was a world power. Even Spain was a world power. The United Kingdom, it was a power. They just recently got out of a war against them, and even after the Revolution War, there was still some tension. That's the reason why a new war came in 1812, I believe, when they burned down the White House. You see, there was still conflict going on between, European powers and the Americans, and Americans was you can say a colony full of their own individual countries, with the federal government, whose job was to protect all the states. But every state managed their own territory, their own country, you can say. And in that time, blacks, there was free blacks, but there was also many slaves who were black. So this is a country that was it was a society that was built by Germans, British, and Dutch. Okay, Germans did not have a nation in that time. It was a group of independent nations in the area of Germany. They were not unified yet. They were about to. They were beginning to. You also had the Netherlands, Dutch, and British. The British Empire, of course. And they made this colonies. They made the colonies. The French were seen as allies because of the help that they received during the time of the revolution. France supported the colonies because they were enemies of England, and Spain as well did a little. But this was a society that was a white Protestant country. It was a white Protestant nation, an early nation. Now, if you look at the whole entire world history, most of the power has been focused on one region, the Middle East. And the Middle East is composed by Egypt, you can say Babylon, Persia, Greece, even the Roman Empire, that area of the Mediterranean area. I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say the Middle East. I want to say the Mediterranean area. Greece, Turkey, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon and Persia in some way. It was a little bit far off, but it was still, they controlled that region. But you can say that region of the Mediterranean was the center, has been the center of humanity for such a long time. Now, when you look at that, if you look at the Mediterranean, if you go east, you'll find that they're Eastern Europeans. If you go north, you'll find out that they are Northern Europeans. They're Nordic people. And if you go south, you'll find out that they are Africans and they have darker skin. Okay? So this is the area of the Middle East. This is the area in the Mediterranean area. And for such a long time, the power belonged to the people that look more like Middle Easterns. Just look at the I know they're different groups of people, but the Egyptians, the Greeks, they kind of have the same kind of skin tone and the features. You know, they kind of somehow looked similar, like you know, the people in the Levant area. You'll find similarities between them, even though they're different. You'll have some similarities between them. This is the place that's always been the power, and because it's the center, they do have somehow a mixture of East Asians, Northern Europeans, and the Africans from the south who are black. You'll find out that there is a mixture. For the first time, somehow the power switched to Europe. The power switched to Europe. I'm just giving you a little brief history. The power switched to Europe because during the times of the Crusades and after the Spanish Inquisition, you know, there was conflict between the Ottoman Empire and the East and the Western powers. So because the Ottoman Empire ruled that sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and in order for them to get to the other side, because they knew about Asia, they knew about India, they knew about China, they needed to find a new route. And when they went to find a new route, that is when they stumbled with the Americas, and there was a great opportunity for them. They found gold, and the Europeans became very prosperous, and then they began to begin to use lands, and they began to buy Africans from Africans. You know, Africans sold their own kind, and that's when you created this new. And all of a sudden, the power shifted from the Middle East to the West. But for the first time, you can say in history, the power, because China was a big power regional, but it never really used its power to the other side of the world. It was only the regional. It's the same thing with Aztec. It was a regional power. But for the first time, you can say that a country that was not located around the Mediterranean area began to use its power. And let's look at it. Let's face it. They look completely different than from the rest of the world. This is the first start of prejudice, of this new type of prejudice. Because prejudice has always existed. But this is the first time when they began to have this white superiority complex. And they began to be reflected upon the world. Because countries like the Native Americans were very isolated for, you know, thousands of years. So they were very behind in the many scientific discoveries compared to the other ones. They were you know, limited. They didn't even have the wheel invented, and you can see that Africa was very under rulership of the Arabs, so they were in a disadvantage. And you had in the power structure was really between the northern part, I think, of India, of northern India and Iran, excuse me, and China. Japan, since it was very isolated, they were spared from being colonized because they used it as their advantage. Okay, so I give you this little brief history about that. Okay, so this is an example of how they were able to see themselves superior than everybody else. So in the Immigration Act, the thing is, we're trying to say like, oh well. They were trying to, you know, limit their own kind, and they were not trying to. The thing is that this country America was have to believe that all men were created equal. But when it comes to the foundation of the country, it was really about this. They wanted Dutch, Germans, British, Protestant, Western Christian was their main focus. It was a new land for the Western Christians. It was more about it was more of a cultural idea than it was about a skin idea. Now the skin idea, the skin color issue, it's something that at the same time it made sense during this time, because if you look in time, there is no such thing as a Civil Rights Act in any country. It never existed, my friends. Ancient Persia was one of the early nations that kind of pushed for that, and there was one dynasty in China that kind of pushed for that, but there was no such thing as that. It was very, you know, if you were different in that nation, it was really about receiving favor. That's what it was. They didn't really take their time to look, oh, how many people do we have that are different? We're going to try to fight for their rights. That didn't exist until, America came to the picture. What it was in the past, it was just more like, okay, you're different, you don't belong here, but I'm going to like you because, you helped me out. That's how it was. And it's been always like that throughout the time in the world. So when it came to here, what happened is that this is a country that was intended to be for Protestant, for Western European. It was pretty much a Western European society. It was yes, it was a land, but it was a new country. They did believe that all men were created equal, but they just had a different belief set in that time. So now here's the thing. It wasn't just white people, because the thing is that Spanish were considered white, but Spanish people had their own colonies. They didn't really fear that Spanish people will come in high drug numbers to the colonies, because the truth is that they didn't want Spanish people as well, because they were Catholic. Look at the immigration wave in that time. They didn't have Eastern Europeans coming into this country. So yes, even though they say that it's white, but white was considered British and Germans and Dutch. And even in that time, they were, there was a fear. I don't know who it was exactly, but there was one founding father, I don't know if it was Benjamin Franklin, that was kind of concerned that the colonists would have been taken over by the Germans, even though apparently Germans were not white enough as compared to English and the British. This is funny, but that's how they used to think. And this has happened that, I know it seems like, oh, this is pretty unfair, but this is something that it was very common practices back in the day. Native Americans were very prejudiced people. Of course, you don't believe that they're prejudiced, but they were. They didn't want other people, invaders and white men coming into their land. So this is something that was a very practical thing back in the day. And this is the reason why it's really hard for us to try to use the 1790 Immigration Act and use it with today's lenses. You also got to keep in mind that even though some people in this country disagree with that, and they actually did not mind that other people who were not white came to America, you have to understand that the only reason why they didn't do it is because, number one, there was no Africans. Most of the Africans that were coming into this country were slaves. So the Africans were seen as slaves. And East Asians were seen as different. And Native Americans in that time, there was no mestizos, first of all. Most of the mestizos was very, very early. It was in its early stages, and they were pretty much trying to promote a society of Western European. That's pretty much what it was. It wasn't even just white, because like I said, there was no Eastern Europeans. There was none of that. They were really promoting immigration from areas of Netherlands, Germany, and Britain, and France too, because, for political reasons. Spain was not a country that were immigrating as high drove numbers. Frankly, they would have changed the law if you would have more Spanish coming in there, because Spanish people are Catholics. So what I'm trying to point is that if we look at the historical context, that is prejudice and all that stuff. The white supremacist says this was the intention of the founding fathers, and the race, and the leftists will try to say, oh, it's racist, but it was a different time. It was a different time. The world, right now, the cultures around the whole world have more in common, even though they're way different than they were back in the day. You see, back in the day, cultures were so completely different. I just used the example of how the Mediterranean was the only civilization that kind of kept everybody in contact. Because the Africans, the East Asians, and the Northern Europeans and the Native Americans were completely different from each other. Because the only ones who was that bridge was the Mediterranean power. So we have to look at it from how it was from that perspective. Now, I'm not saying it was a good thing, I'm just saying that just look at it from that perspective. You know, white supremacists will say, well, you know, that was the founding fathers' idea. Well, maybe that was an idea in that time because that's what it made sense in that time. Today, it doesn't really make sense for us to continue. To believe that only white immigration should come in here, because even though societies are different, there is a little bit more in common than it was back in that day. Now, I do believe in limited immigration. I just don't think we should use that same argument in today's times. So I just wanted to share that. There's a little topic, my opinions on the 1790 Immigration Act. I don't think that proves that this was intended to just to be white, because now all of a sudden everybody can be considered white. But you have to look at it. Eastern Europeans were considered different. Italians were not even considered white for a time, and the Irish were also not considered white, even though they were. So it's just, I just wanted to bring clearance to this thing and topic. And my argument is just, it doesn't make sense for us to look back and compare, you know, yesterday's time with today's lenses. That's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. But yeah, you guys have a great day. I just wanted